There are moments in the history of human civilization when an entire society, educated and uneducated alike, wealthy and desperate in equal measure, collectively abandons its capacity for rational judgment, and in its place it embraces something far more dangerous. A story, a promise, a fantasy so intoxicating, so geometrically precise in its logic of endless gain, that to question it becomes an act of social rebellion. These are not moments of ignorance. They are not the blind stumblings of primitive economies. No, they are born from sophistication, from printing presses and telegraph lines, from joint stock legislation, and the quiet, seductive confidence of a society that believes it has finally mastered wealth itself. And it is precisely there, in that confidence, that the seed of catastrophe is planted, because every bubble, at its peak, feels like inevitability, and every victim believes they are early. You're sleeping on a gold mine. At least, that is what they told them. The widows, the clerks, the coal miners, ordinary people drawn into an extraordinary illusion. The year is 1845. Britain stands at the apex of the industrial world, an empire stretched across continents, its financial heart anchored by the Bank of England, its currency moving through global markets with sovereign authority, unchallenged, unquestioned, immovable. And yet, inside this fortress of certainty, something begins to stir. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like pressure building in the boiler of a great machine. Across the drawing rooms of London, the counting houses of Manchester, the merchant offices of Liverpool, Birmingham, Edinburgh, money begins to move. Savings, inheritances, borrowed capital, all flowing toward a single irresistible idea: the railway, the Iron Road, a technological revolution promising to compress distance, to accelerate time, to remake the very fabric of human life. And at first, it is rational, even visionary, but what begins as investment will not remain so. Because while the world sleeps, something else is being built. Not just railways, but a monster, forged not of flesh, but of iron and greed. Thousands of miles of track, some leading nowhere, all fueled by a speculative fever so intense it makes modern manias look almost innocent. They promised a revolution. They delivered a graveyard. Within just 18 months, this controlled burn of optimism will become an inferno. Fortunes reduced to ash, reputations erased, a nation forced to confront the limits of its own belief. And what makes the railway mania so enduringly important, so unsettlingly familiar, is not merely the scale of its destruction. It is the perfection of its mechanism. Clean in its origins, transparent in its ascent, devastating in its collapse. A blueprint, one that echoes forward through the South Sea bubble, the panics of the 19th century, the roaring 20s, the dot-com euphoria, and the great unraveling of 2008. The Iron Road does not end here. It runs through all of them. So tonight, we board that road, the most dangerous ride in financial history. And by the time the sun rises on this story, you may begin to wonder whether we ever truly learned anything at all. And if, at this moment, you can almost hear the hiss of steam, feel the heat of the boiler pressing against the hull of reason, then you already understand something essential. Because these stories are not relics, they are warnings. So if you find yourself drawn to this journey, to the quiet excavation of financial ghosts, to the unearthing of the skeletons buried beneath Wall Street and the London Stock Exchange, then ensure you remain aboard. Subscribe before the train departs the station. And when this account concludes, I invite you to step beyond the role of observer. Tell me, do you believe we have learned anything from these cycles of illusion and collapse? Or are we even now laying fresh track for another iron road? Perhaps in artificial intelligence, in technology, in some new architecture of promise that feels once again inevitable. Leave your thoughts below. I read them all. Every reflection, every dissent, every uneasy recognition. Because the most dangerous assumption in financial history has always been that this time is different. To understand why the railway mania matters, not as a curiosity of Victorian history, but as a living, breathing template for financial destruction, one must first understand the world into which it emerged. Britain in the 1840s was not merely a wealthy nation. It was something far rarer, the singular engine of global economic modernity, a country that had not only embraced industrial capitalism, but had, in many ways, invented it. And now it was exporting that logic to the rest of the world. The steam engine, the mechanized loom, the coal-fired furnace, these were not abstractions. They were British creations, and the wealth they generated had accumulated in British hands to a degree that history had never before witnessed. By the mid-1840s, British capital markets had reached a level of sophistication that no rival nation could approach. The Joint Stock Company, a legal architecture both elegant and dangerous, allowed thousands of individuals to pool their capital while diffusing their risk into something almost invisible. Responsibility diluted, opportunity magnified, and at the center of it all stood the London Stock Exchange. Formalized in 1801, it had become the gravitational core of global investment, a place where paper claims were transformed into perceived reality and where belief could be priced. But perhaps most important of all was this: the railway had already proven itself. This was no fantasy, no speculative dream conjured from thin air. Lines such as the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, and the expanding networks connecting London to Birmingham and stretching westward through the Great Western had demonstrated something undeniable. The technology worked, and more than that, it paid. Early investors did not merely profit, they prospered, not in fleeting paper valuations, but in steady, dividend-bearing returns. Real wealth, durable wealth, built upon the simple, observable truth that steam locomotion could move goods and people faster and cheaper than anything that had come before. And it is precisely this solid empirical foundation that made what followed so dangerously inevitable. Because the most powerful bubbles are never built on lies, they are built on truth, distorted, extended, and finally, unrecognizable. The early success of the railway did not warn investors, it convinced them. It provided the evidence, the proof, the narrative that transformed cautious optimism into absolute certainty. And once certainty takes hold, speculation requires no justification, only participation. The stakes of this story extend far beyond Victorian drawing rooms and candlelit ledgers, because every great financial bubble follows the same quiet architecture. It begins with a genuine innovation, something real, something transformative. Then come the early adopters who profit enormously, and in doing so, validate the idea. What follows is not caution, but expansion, a widening circle of belief in which the original innovation is no longer the destination, but merely the vehicle. A vehicle for speculation, for leverage, for dreams untethered from arithmetic. And then, inevitably, the collapse. Not always sudden, not always dramatic, but always merciless. What remains is the reckoning, long, painful, and clarifying. The railway mania is the purest expression of this cycle, the original template, and what it reveals about human psychology, about institutional failure, about regulation bent quietly toward power, about a press that amplifies euphoria rather than questions it, and above all, about the seductive power of narrative over numbers, remains as precise and as relevant today as it was when the first railway share certificates were passed hand to hand across coffeehouse tables in the city of London. And then something shifts. Not in the machinery, not in the iron rails being laid across the English countryside, but in the mind. Because by 1844, the railway had ceased to be merely an industry. It had become an idea. And ideas, when they capture the financial imagination, do not expand gradually, they ignite. The year 1844 did not announce itself as extraordinary. There was no single moment, no bell, no proclamation declaring the beginning of the age. What occurred instead was far more subtle and far more dangerous. A change in tone, in conversation, in expectation. Parliament, seeking order, instead created acceleration. The Railway Regulation Act of 1844, introduced under the guidance of William Ewart Gladstone, was designed to impose a framework, to ensure fair pricing, to guarantee minimum service, to anchor the railway system to public utility. But embedded within this structure was something unintended, legitimacy. By acknowledging the railway as an essential national system, the state did not restrain speculation, it sanctified it. And in doing so, it sent a signal, clear, unmistakable, and profoundly misinterpreted. If the government recognized the railway, then surely it could not fail. At precisely the same moment, another force was gathering strength. Money itself was becoming easier. Interest rates drifted downward, capital sought return, and the traditional avenues, land, government bonds, colonial trade, began to feel insufficient. And so capital moved, not cautiously, but eagerly, toward railways. The structure of participation made this movement explosive because railway shares were not paid in full. They were subscribed, a deposit placed, a commitment made, with the remainder deferred into the future. This was leverage before the word had fully entered common use. An ordinary investor could command a large position with a small initial outlay, and as prices began to rise, the illusion formed that wealth itself required very little capital. By 1845, the tempo had changed entirely. What had been interest became urgency. What had been opportunity became inevitability. New railway schemes did not emerge one by one. They arrived in waves. Proposed lines not merely connecting major cities, but slicing through rural counties, linking towns whose economic justification was, at best, optimistic. And yet they were funded eagerly. Prospectuses flooded the market, printed in elegant type, filled with projections, maps, and promises. Each one a narrative of inevitability, each one a claim upon the future. And the public did not resist, they participated. Clerks, shopkeepers, lawyers, widows investing their savings, country gentlemen reallocating estates, all drawn into the same expanding orbit. The railway share became more than an asset. It became a social phenomenon, a topic of daily conversation, a marker of intelligence, of modernity, of belonging. And in the coffee houses of the city, where information moved faster than any locomotive, prices began to detach from the slow physical reality of construction. Lines that did not yet exist, companies that possessed little more than parliamentary approval, were valued as if their success were already assured. This was the ignition point, not when the first tracks were laid, but when belief outpaced reality. Because the defining characteristic of the boom phase is not simply rising prices, it is the disappearance of doubt. Voices of caution did exist, quietly, persistently, but they were drowned, not by argument, but by momentum. The press, far from acting as a brake, became an accelerant. Newspapers carried glowing reports, celebrated new schemes, and transformed speculation into spectacle. To question the railway boom was no longer to offer prudence, it was to reveal oneself as backward, as incapable of understanding the future that was already arriving. And so participation widened, faster, further, until restraint itself began to look irrational. By late 1845, the numbers reached a scale that should have inspired alarm. Hundreds of proposed lines, capital requirements so vast that even Britain's immense financial resources were being stretched to their limit. And yet, the reaction was not fear, it was exhilaration. Because in a true mania, scale is not perceived as risk, it is perceived as confirmation. The larger the system becomes, the more impossible its failure appears. This is the moment when a market ceases to function as a mechanism of valuation and becomes instead a mechanism of belief. And belief, once untethered from constraint, does not correct itself. It expands relentlessly, quietly, logically within its own distorted frame, until the arithmetic, long ignored, begins to reassert itself. But that comes later. For now, in the closing months of 1845, Britain stood at the height of railway euphoria, a nation convinced not merely of prosperity, but of inevitability. And it is here, at the very peak of confidence, that the foundations of collapse are most completely laid, because the system now depended on something fragile, something intangible, something that could not be engineered or legislated or guaranteed: confidence. And like all such structures, it would hold only until the moment it didn't. The core concept. Charon has traded his wooden oar for a steam regulator. He isn't just a mythical figure. He is the weary witness to Victorian greed. The voice should sound like it has been cured in coal smoke and dampened by the mist of the river Styx. To understand how Britain arrived at the very edge of the abyss in 1845, one must step backward, further than the frenzy, further than the speculation, into the quiet decade where the conditions were set and the kindling carefully arranged. The first spark came in September 1825 with the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, engineered by George Stephenson. It was not, at first, a grand vision, merely a practical line designed to move coal from the Durham coal fields to the port at Stockton. A simple efficiency. And yet, its success was immediate, undeniable. Within 5 years, something more ambitious emerged: the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And this changed everything. For the first time, steam locomotion proved that it could move not only goods, but people at speeds that rendered horse-drawn transport obsolete. Distance began to collapse. Time itself seemed to contract, and the returns were extraordinary. Early shareholders did not wait decades. They were rewarded quickly. Dividends of 10% and often more. Not promises, not projections, but money paid. And so the investment community began to watch closely. And where attention flows, capital soon follows. Parliament, which held the authority to approve each railway through individual acts of legislation, found itself increasingly occupied. Through the late 1830s and into the early 1840s, railway bills began to pass with growing frequency. The machine was beginning to turn. By 1843, Britain had emerged from a period of economic difficulty, a recession now fading, momentum returning, confidence rebuilding. And at the center of this shift stood the Bank of England. In response to improving conditions, interest rates were allowed to fall to levels rarely seen before. A policy designed to stimulate growth, to encourage investment, to awaken the economy. And it worked, but not in the way intended. Because low interest rates do not merely encourage productive enterprise, they also reshape incentives. Government bonds, once the quiet refuge of cautious wealth, now offered meager returns. Savings felt stagnant, and in their place, something far more alluring emerged. Equities, risk, opportunity, speculation began to look rational. This mechanism, so subtle, so easily justified, will repeat itself again and again across the centuries. It is here that we must pause and take note, because historians have studied this moment with particular care. Among them, Andrew Odlyzko, whose meticulous archival work reveals just how deeply monetary conditions shaped the mania to come. With interest rates low and railway profits already proven, capital began to move, at first steadily, then in volume. New railway projects appeared across the country, and in 1844, Parliament intervened, passing what became known as Gladstone's Act, a measure intended to introduce oversight, to impose structure, to ensure accessibility through provisions such as third-class carriages and the possibility of future government purchase. It was, by all appearances, a rational response. But markets rarely interpret regulation as caution. They interpret it as validation. The message received was not restraint, it was endorsement. The railway was no longer merely an industry. It had become institutional, permanent, sanctioned. And so, at the precise moment when skepticism was most needed, credibility was amplified. By the summer of 1844, the shift became visible. Railway promotion accelerated. New lines proposed in every direction, not always guided by engineers, not always justified by economic need, but driven by something far more powerful: demand. The demand for railway shares. Investors, increasingly convinced that any railway, anywhere, would inevitably produce the same extraordinary returns as those early lines. And here, something subtle but fatal began to occur. The distinction between a good railway and a good investment began to dissolve. Steel and track no longer mattered. Geography no longer mattered. Demand no longer mattered. Only the certificate, only the promise, and in that quiet dissolution lay the true mechanism of the mania itself.
And then the line is crossed, so quietly, so imperceptibly, that those within it do not feel the transition at all. The year is 1845, and what had been expansion becomes explosion. Railway promotion no longer proceeds with deliberation. It erupts. In the opening months of the year, schemes multiply at a rate that defies comprehension. Not dozens, not even hundreds, but hundreds upon hundreds of proposed lines, each one seeking parliamentary approval, each one demanding capital, each one promising certainty. The countryside of Britain is no longer mapped by rivers or roads, but by projected railways, lines crossing lines, routes duplicating routes, entire regions overwritten with ink before a single rail is laid. And yet, This does not provoke hesitation, it provokes urgency. Because now the logic has inverted. The question is no longer, should one invest, but rather, how quickly can one participate before the opportunity disappears? Subscription lists open and close within days, sometimes hours. Crowds gather, not at construction sites, but at offices, at brokers' desks, at any place where a signature can secure an allocation. The railway share has transformed again. It is no longer merely an investment. It is a ticket into a system that appears to generate wealth almost automatically. And the structure makes this illusion irresistible. Deposits remain small, installments deferred. The language of commitment replaces the reality of payment. A man of modest means can subscribe to multiple lines, 10, 20, sometimes more. Each position a promise to pay later, each promise treated as if it were already fulfilled. And as prices rise, those promises themselves acquire value. They are traded, assigned, sold for profit. Thus emerges a peculiar alchemy. Wealth created not from cash, but from obligation. And in this environment, discipline collapses. Engineers, once central to railway planning, are now peripheral. Their calculations, their surveys, their cautions become inconvenient. Promoters take their place, men skilled not in construction, but in persuasion. Among them, figures such as George Hudson, celebrated, admired, and rarely questioned. Hudson, the self-styled railway king, embodied the spirit of the age, a man whose reputation was built not merely on railways, but on rising share prices, on confidence, on momentum. And momentum was everything. Because by mid-1845, the system had reached a critical state. It no longer required success to sustain itself, only continuation. New schemes fund old expectations. New investors support existing valuations. New narratives justify expanding scale. It is a structure perfectly stable so long as it continues to grow, and utterly fragile the moment it does not. Parliament itself begins to strain under the pressure. The volume of railway bills submitted for approval becomes overwhelming. Committees sit for endless hours, reviewing proposals, hearing testimony, attempting to impose order on something that no longer respects it. This period will later be known as the Railway Parliament, not because Parliament controlled the boom, but because it was consumed by it. And still, the flow continues. By the autumn of 1845, the numbers reach their apex. Proposed capital, measured in sums so vast that they approach the limits of national capacity. And yet, within the system, this is not perceived as excess. It is perceived as destiny. Because a final transformation has now occurred. The railway is no longer evaluated as infrastructure. It is understood as inevitability. To doubt it is to doubt progress itself. To question it is to stand against the future. And so doubt disappears entirely, not defeated, not answered, simply excluded. The newspapers speak with one voice: optimism, certainty, expansion. Stories of profit circulate endlessly. Fortunes made in weeks, in days, sometimes in a single transaction. Losses, when they occur, are dismissed, temporary, irrelevant, exceptions to a rule that no longer feels like a theory, but a law. And in drawing rooms and counting houses and crowded exchanges, a quiet assumption takes hold, so pervasive, so rarely spoken out loud, that it becomes invisible, that prices will continue to rise, not because they should, but because they have. This is the peak, not defined by the highest price, but by the absence of restraint. A system running at full velocity with no mechanism left to slow it. And it is here, precisely here, at the moment of maximum confidence, maximum participation, maximum belief, that the first fractures begin to form. Invisible at first, dismissed when noticed, but real. Because beneath the paper wealth, beneath the promises, beneath the endless expansion, there remains something immovable: arithmetic. And arithmetic does not bend to narrative. It waits quietly, patiently, for the moment when it is no longer possible to ignore it.
There are moments in every great financial mania when the story finds its protagonist. In the case of the railway mania, that man was George Hudson. He was not an engineer, not a builder of machines, not a designer of iron or steel. He was something else entirely, a builder of belief. Born in 1800 in the East Riding of Yorkshire, the son of a farmer, Hudson's origins were unremarkable. His ascent was not forged in industry, but in inheritance. A distant relative left him a sum of money, enough to begin, enough to enter the drapery trade in York. And from there, his rise was swift, relentless, driven not by caution, but by an instinct for promotion. By the late 1830s, he had entered the railway world, not as a technician, but as a force. The driving power behind the York and North Midland Railway, and a man who understood, with a clarity that bordered on genius, a simple, devastating truth: that building railways and selling the idea of railways were not the same thing, and it was the second that mattered more. Hudson's method was elegant, almost beautiful in its simplicity. He understood that investors do not merely seek returns, they seek reassurance, not once, but continuously, visibly, psychologically. And so he gave it to them. Dividends, generous, consistent, reliable, paid with a rhythm that felt inevitable. Shareholders did not feel as though they were speculating. They felt as though they were participating in something historic, a national triumph. And yet, beneath the surface, something far less stable was taking shape, because those dividends were not always drawn
from real profit. They were often drawn from something else: new money, fresh capital, investment used to pay investment, a structure that modern eyes would recognize instantly, an echo of what would later be named by Charles Ponzi. But in the 1840s, there was no such language, only momentum and belief. By the mid-1840s, Hudson's influence was immense. He controlled more railway mileage than any other individual in Britain. He was a member of Parliament for Sunderland. He served as Lord Mayor of York. He was received by Arthur Wellington, 1st Duke of Wellington, celebrated by the Prince Consort, and elevated by the press to something approaching myth. They called him the Railway King, a title that captured not only his power, but something deeper, the degree to which the public had invested not just money, but imagination. To question Hudson was to question the railways, and to question the railways in 1845 was to place oneself outside the age itself. An eccentric, a reactionary, a man who simply did not understand the future. But Hudson was only the figurehead. The true scale of the mania lay elsewhere, in its reach. Because what made the railway mania truly extraordinary was not its wealth, but its breadth, its quiet invasion of every layer of society. The records reveal a public of astonishing variety. Yes, there were institutions, merchant banks, insurance companies, country banks feeding capital into London. But beyond them, there were others: clergymen, school teachers, widows living on fixed incomes, retired officers, small tradesmen, domestic servants who had saved carefully over decades, and the professional classes: lawyers, doctors, engineers. Men and women who did not believe they were speculating, but planning for security, for family, for the future. And in that belief lay the final transformation, because the railway share became something more than an investment. It became a symbol, a marker of modernity, of intelligence, of participation in the great national project of progress. Writers of the time captured this shift with unsettling clarity. Charles Dickens, watching from his study as the railways reshaped the landscape and the minds of those within it, and John Francis, who would later document how deeply this belief had taken hold. To own railway shares in 1845 was not merely to invest, it was to belong to the future. And once a society begins to believe that the future can be purchased in the form of a certificate, the outcome is no longer uncertain.
Every great financial catastrophe feels in hindsight like chaos. But in truth, it is not chaos at all. It is structure, a system composed of smaller systems, each reinforcing the other until the whole becomes unstoppable. The railway mania was no exception. It did not erupt in a single moment of madness. It was built piece by piece, mechanism by mechanism. A machine designed not by any single mind, but assembled through incentives. And once it began to move, it became extraordinarily difficult to stop. The first mechanism was deceptively simple, the deposit system. Under the laws of the time, a railway promoter did not need to raise the full cost of a proposed line, only a fraction, typically 10%, a small threshold for a very large promise. And so, an investor did not need great wealth to participate, only a deposit. The remainder could be paid later as construction progressed or as optimism endured. This created something powerful, leverage, a quiet amplification of both hope and risk. A clerk earning £50 a year could subscribe to shares worth several hundred, a life savings transformed into an illusion of scale. And as long as prices rose, the illusion felt real. Paper gains could exceed annual income in a matter of weeks. Distance between modest means and imagined wealth collapsed. And once that distance collapses, restraint often follows. The second mechanism was more subtle, institutional, the parliamentary process. Every railway required approval, a formal act debated, examined, legitimized, at least in appearance, because by 1845 the volume had become overwhelming. Over 1,200 railway bills submitted in a single session, a number so vast that scrutiny became impossible. Committees strained under the weight, and in that strain, standards shifted. Decisions were influenced not by economic viability, but by presentation, by legal argument, by political connection. As observed by O. MacDonough, the process had transformed. It no longer filtered, it legitimized. It gave projects the appearance of rigor without the substance. And to the investor, appearance was enough. The third mechanism was louder, more pervasive, the press. The 1840s were an age of expanding print. Newspapers multiplied, circulation surged, information flowed faster and further than ever before. And railway promoters understood this perfectly. Columns filled with railway prospectuses, opportunities, projections, promises, presented not as advertisements, but as information. The line between analysis and promotion blurred, then disappeared. Publications such as the Railway Times became less observers and more participants, their survival dependent on the very industry they described. Conflict of interest was not hidden, it was invisible, because it was everywhere. The fourth mechanism was not institutional, it was human, what modern thought would call social proof and availability. When every newspaper, every conversation, every letter tells the same story, that railways are profitable, that shares are rising, that early investors are wealthy, and hesitation is regret, then the cost of doubt becomes unbearable. Independent analysis requires effort, but belief is effortless when it is shared. And so the narrative deepens until it becomes indistinguishable from reality. This is not ignorance, it is adaptation, a rational mind responding to an overwhelming environment of agreement. And finally,
the fifth mechanism, the one that feeds them all: money. Not merely its existence, but its abundance. As interest rates fell, safe returns diminished. Government bonds lost their appeal. Savings felt stagnant, and capital began to search for yield, for movement, for possibility. But there was more, because beyond the great institutions lay the country banks, provincial, trusted, embedded in local life, and they too became entangled, extending credit to investors, accepting railway shares as collateral, even promoting the schemes themselves. And in doing so, they created something both powerful and fragile: a loop. Credit fueling investment, investment driving prices, rising prices justifying more credit, a cycle feeding upon itself, until the distinction between cause and effect disappeared entirely. And once that happens, once a system begins to sustain itself through its own momentum, collapse is no longer a question of if, only of when.
There is a peculiar sensation that accompanies the careful study of financial history. Not surprise, but recognition. A historian who reads the record of the railway mania and feels nothing stir, no quiet echo of the present, is not paying attention. Because what unfolds in the 1840s is not confined to the 1840s. It is a pattern, a structure so consistent that it begins to feel mechanical. The elements recur. A genuine innovation, a monetary environment that quietly pushes capital toward risk, an entry structure that allows participation with very little initial sacrifice, a media system that amplifies belief rather than interrogates it, a regulatory framework that legitimizes more than it scrutinizes, and finally, a social atmosphere in which doubt is not merely discouraged but punished. These are not anomalies, they are the blueprint, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. Consider the late 1990s, the rise of the internet, a revolution as real, as transformative as the railway itself. It reshaped commerce, communication, human connection, and in its earliest stages, it delivered extraordinary rewards. Companies like Amazon and Google did not merely succeed, they defined the future. And so belief followed. The monetary environment was accommodating, capital was available, risk was encouraged, quietly, systemically, and the structure of entry mirrored the past. Initial public offerings allowed investors to gain exposure with limited capital and unlimited imagination. The media played its part. Networks like CNBC and publications such as the Wall Street Journal became conduits not merely of information, but of enthusiasm. A new economy, they called it, and to question it was to misunderstand it. To hesitate was to be left behind. The language was different, but the structure was identical. And then the pattern repeated again. In 2007 and 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis. This time, the innovation was not technological, but financial. complex instruments, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, designed to transform risk into safety, or at least the appearance of safety. Under the stewardship of Alan Greenspan, interest rates remained low for years. Capital, once again, was pushed outward, searching. The entry point was familiar: mortgages with minimal initial payments, access without immediate consequence. The regulatory system performed its role, approving, legitimizing, but not always understanding. And the ratings agencies assigned their quiet blessing, AAA, a symbol of certainty where none truly existed. The media echoed the reassurance, and the public believed, because the alternative was uncomfortable. To question the system was to question prosperity itself. And so the cycle completed again. What these parallels reveal is not simply that history repeats. It is something more precise, more unsettling. That the conditions which produce these manias are not errors, they are not aberrations, they are the natural output of a system built on human incentives. The desire for wealth, the fear of being left behind, the comfort of moving with the crowd, and the quiet difficulty of maintaining independent judgment when surrounded by overwhelming agreement. These are not flaws that can be corrected. They are constants. And as long as they endure, the pattern will endure with them. The names will change. The technologies will evolve. The language will modernize. But the structure, the underlying architecture of belief, of speculation, of collapse, will remain exactly the same. And so the question is not whether another mania will come, but whether, when it does, we will recognize it for what it is, or once again mistake it for the future.
To speak of the railway mania as a failure of mass psychology alone is to misunderstand it. Yes, there was euphoria. Yes, there was delusion. But these were only the surface. Beneath them operated something far more enduring, a network of incentives, institutional, professional, financial, not merely benefiting from the mania, but depending on it, and in many cases quietly ensuring that it continued long after its collapse had become inevitable. The first of these was the law. The legal profession stood at the very center of the railway machine. Every proposed line required representation, petitions to be drafted, arguments to be made, land to be transferred, and each step generated fees, substantial fees. By 1845, with over 1,000 railway bills passing through Parliament, the scale became extraordinary. As later documented by Henry Grote Lewin, the legal costs alone consumed a significant share of the industry's capital. But here lies the crucial detail. The lawyer's incentive was not tied to the success of the railway, not to its profitability, not even to its completion, only to the continuation of the process. And so long as new schemes emerged, the system remained profitable. Whether the railways worked was almost incidental. The second institution was the surveyor. Every railway proposal required a survey, a technical document meant to describe reality, the land, the gradients, the cost. But during the mania, time was short, demand was overwhelming, and so standards began to bend. Surveyors became scarce, fees rose, and in response, the profession expanded, rapidly, not always carefully. Untrained laborers were dispatched into the field, given instruction just sufficient to produce something resembling data, and what they produced often bore only a passing resemblance to truth. Gradients softened, obstacles minimized, costs reduced, not through malice, but through incentive, because the purpose of the survey was not accuracy, it was approval, to satisfy parliamentary requirement and move the scheme forward. Reality could be corrected later or ignored entirely. The third institution was banking, and here the structure deepens. At the local level, country banks extended credit to clerks, to merchants, to ordinary investors seeking entry into the railway boom. Shares became collateral, and rising prices justified further lending. But beyond this lay a more subtle dynamic. The great houses of London, Barings Bank, Rothschild & Co., Hambros Bank, institutions of immense sophistication. They did not rush blindly into speculation. They selected, they calculated, they invested in quality, and avoided the worst excesses. But this restraint carried its own implication, because to distinguish between value and illusion is a form of power, and that power depends on the existence of others who cannot. A market requires both, the informed and the hopeful. And so even discipline became part of the system, not opposing the mania, but coexisting with it, profiting from its inefficiencies. The case of George Hudson reveals this entanglement with particular clarity. His relationships with provincial banks were not incidental, they were foundational. They provided credit, they reinforced reputation, they created mutual dependence. A banker exposed to Hudson's success had little incentive to question it, because to question it was to endanger not only the client, but the balance sheet. And so scrutiny softened. Auditors operated within this same web, a profession still in its infancy, without the independence we now assume. And within this environment, irregularities persisted. Dividends paid from capital, accounts adjusted, losses obscured, not always through conspiracy, but through alignment. Because when every incentive points towards continuation, truth becomes inconvenient, and inconvenience is rarely rewarded. The press completed the structure, not as observer, but as participant. Publications such as the Railway Times, the Railway Chronicle, the Railway Gazette were sustained by the very industry they described. Advertising was not peripheral, it was essential. And so skepticism carried a cost, a financial cost. To question a railway scheme was to risk revenue, to risk access, to risk survival. And so the tone remained consistent, optimistic, encouraging, certain, not because truth demanded it, but because structure required it. There was, however, an exception, a single voice that resisted. The Economist, founded by James Wilson, maintained a different stance, measured, analytical, skeptical.
Among its contributors was Walter Bagehot, who approached railway schemes not with enthusiasm, but with arithmetic, revenue versus cost, expectation versus reality. And again, the conclusion emerged. Most schemes could not work, not under realistic assumptions, not under honest accounting, not under any conditions that resembled reality. The analysis was sound, the reasoning clear, the warning unambiguous, and yet it was ignored. Because in a system sustained by belief, truth is not rejected because it is wrong, it is rejected because it is unwelcome. And when an entire society finds arithmetic inconvenient, the outcome is no longer uncertain.
There is a moment in every great speculative cycle when growth quietly becomes instability, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally. The summer of 1845 was that moment. What modern minds might call a phase transition. The same forces that had driven the market upward were now, through their very success, preparing its descent. And yet, to those living within it, nothing seemed wrong. Prosperity appeared intact. Confidence remained unshaken. But beneath the surface, the arithmetic had already turned. The scale is difficult to comprehend. As recorded by John Francis, in the span of just 1 year, from the autumn of 1844 to the autumn of 1845, proposals emerged for more than 9,000 miles of new railway, at a projected cost exceeding $200 million. A figure so vast that it rivaled nearly 4 years of total government revenue. And yet, this capital was being committed to projects that had received almost no serious scrutiny. The machine was now running on momentum alone. And momentum has a peculiar property. It conceals the limits of reality. Because even as new lines were proposed, the existing network was beginning to strain. Competition emerged, routes overlapped, traffic divided. The early railways had thrived in a world without rivals, but that world no longer existed. Lines such as those tied to George Hudson began to feel pressure. Revenue was no longer boundless, it was finite, contested. And as the network expanded, something inevitable occurred. Returns began to diminish. Each new mile of track generated less value than the last. But investors did not adjust. They continued to project the future using the past, a fatal miscalculation, because the conditions that had created the early fortunes had already disappeared. This is the quiet law of every technological boom. The first entrants profit most, the late entrants inherit competition, and yet they pay the highest price. Then another shift, subtle but decisive. The Bank of England began to act. Through 1845, it had watched, carefully and with growing unease. In October, it moved. Interest rates were raised, not dramatically, from 2.5% to 3%, and then higher. By modern standards, a small adjustment. But within a system built on cheap money, it was seismic. Because speculation depends on cost, and when the cost of money rises, the margin disappears. The leveraged investor faces a simple equation: sustain the position with more capital or liquidate. And once liquidation begins, it rarely remains contained. It spreads, quietly at first, then rapidly. At the same time, another force emerged, unrelated and yet decisive. The harvest of 1845 failed, a detail easily overlooked, but in an agricultural economy, deeply significant. Grain prices rose, incomes fell. Across the countryside, pressure built, and the country banks, already exposed to railway speculation, found themselves strained from two directions: agricultural losses and collapsing collateral. The system tightened, credit became scarce, and scarcity changes behavior. Then the market itself began to speak, reconstructed later with extraordinary precision by Andrew Odlyzko. Railway share prices reached their peak in the autumn of 1845, and then they began to fall. At first, gently, 5%, 10, 15, not enough to create panic, only enough to create doubt, and doubt is easily suppressed. Investors told themselves what investors always tell themselves: that the decline was temporary, that fundamentals remained sound, that patience would be rewarded. They could not yet see what had already begun: the difference between a correction and a collapse. Then came the autumn, and with it the final mechanism: obligation. Because many of the railway schemes were already approved, they were no longer proposals, they were commitments, legal entities, with shareholders, with responsibilities, and most critically, with capital calls. The remaining payments on shares began to arrive. 80, 90% of the total value still owed, and they arrived at the worst possible moment, when prices had already fallen. The investor who had paid £10 on a £100 share now faced a demand for the remaining 90 on an asset worth perhaps 50. Loss before completion, and the consequences spread outward. Assets were sold, bonds, property, possessions. Credit was called in, banks tightened, businesses unrelated to railways felt the strain. Employment fell, construction slowed, then stopped, and beneath it all, the human cost emerged. Families ruined, savings erased, obligations unpayable, lives irrevocably altered. This was not an abstract collapse, it was personal, total, and at its center, the figure who had embodied the age could not escape it. George Hudson began to fall. As scrutiny finally emerged, the truths long obscured became visible. Dividends from capital, land sold to his own companies at inflated prices, accounts reshaped, reality deferred, until it could no longer be. Investigations revealed everything. Too late. Hudson was ruined. His career ended. He fled into exile. A man once celebrated, now reduced to a cautionary memory. And in time, even that memory began to fade. Because societies that survive financial catastrophe develop a curious habit. They remember the lesson, but forget the feeling. And it is the feeling that matters most.
There is, at the center of the railway mania, a truth Not a detail, not a statistic, but something deeper, more durable, more uncomfortable. A truth that has been observed again and again by historians, by economists, by those who study the quiet patterns beneath human behavior. And yet, despite its clarity, it remains unlearned. That truth is this: speculative manias are not accidents. They are not distortions of the system. They are products of it, natural, predictable, the result of a particular alignment, a real innovation, easy money, accessible leverage, and an information system that rewards belief more than truth. When these forces converge, the outcome is not uncertain. It is inevitable. The railway was real. It did transform Britain. The tracks that were laid did connect cities. They did accelerate trade. They did reshape industry. They did compress distance and redefine time. The technology worked. The future it promised arrived. But here is the fracture. Because the value created by that transformation and the wealth captured by those who funded it were not the same thing, not even close. The investors who financed the railway network largely did not profit from it. The society did. Manufacturers moved goods more cheaply. Workers traveled farther. Markets expanded. The nation grew richer. But the individuals who provided the capital paid the cost. Economic historians estimate that between 1 and 200 million pounds of private wealth was destroyed, not vanished, transferred from the many to the few, to promoters, to intermediaries, to those positioned closest to the flow. What had been presented as opportunity revealed itself as something else, a system through which private savings were converted into public infrastructure, not voluntarily, but through belief, through narrative, through trust. It resembled less an investment and more a tax. This dynamic was not overlooked. It was studied, perhaps most clearly by Joseph Schumpeter, who argued that this destruction was not incidental, but essential, that capitalism advances through cycles in which financial value is sacrificed to create real value, that the mania served a purpose, mobilizing capital at a scale no cautious system could achieve, and that the losses were simply the price. It is a powerful argument and a cold one, because from the perspective of the system, it makes sense, but from the perspective of the individual, it offers no comfort. Not to the widow who lost her savings, not to the clergyman who lost his living, not to the officer who lost his pension. For them, the system did not create value, it absorbed it. And yet, the deepest revelation lies elsewhere, not in the losses, but in the failure. Because the railway mania was not driven by ignorance. The truth was available, published by The Economist, analyzed by engineers such as Robert Stephenson, observed by institutions including the Bank of England. The warning signs were visible, the arithmetic was clear, the outcome could be calculated, and still it continued. Why? Because the problem was not information, it was incentive. Every institution within the system, the lawyers, the bankers, the surveyors, the press, the promoters, benefited from continuation. And so, continuation is what they produced. Not through conspiracy, but through alignment. Each actor behaving rationally within their own interest, creating, collectively, an irrational outcome. This is the mechanism. This is the pattern, not hidden, but repeated across centuries, across technologies, across markets. And it leads to a final conclusion.
that financial crises are not caused by bad information, but by good information that is ignored. Ignored because acknowledging it would disrupt the system that rewards its silence. And until those incentives change, until truth becomes more profitable than belief, the architecture of the mania will rebuild itself again and again, under new names, new technologies, new promises, but with the same structure and the same result: a transfer of wealth from those who believe to those who understand. And at the very end, when the system collapses, as it always does, the question will remain, as it has always remained. Not what happened, but why did we believe it again?
Stand for a moment. In the English countryside of 1850, the scars are still visible. Great cuttings through chalk and clay. Viaducts arching across valleys. Iron bridges stitched into the land. The evidence of something immense. A mobilization of labor, of capital, of belief. And it worked. The trains run, goods move, cities expand, the nation accelerates. But elsewhere, in quieter places, another story unfolds. In churchyards, in counting houses, in modest homes across 100 towns, the people who paid for it all are reckoning, quietly, with what they have lost. The railway mania left Britain with a railway network. It left its investors with very little else. The Iron Road ran straight and true, from coal to port, from factory to capital, from present into future. But the claims of those who funded it were consumed, burned in the furnace of speculation, fuel for a machine whose ultimate beneficiary was not the investor, but the economy itself. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes with a precision that demands attention. The same architecture returns: genuine innovation, easy money, accessible leverage, institutional complicity, and a narrative so pervasive it becomes indistinguishable from truth. It has appeared again and again in equities, in property, in digital assets. The technologies change, the language evolves, the speed increases, but the structure remains. A society's excitement about the future becomes a mechanism through which savings are extracted and redistributed. The figure at the center also returns. George Hudson may be gone, but his reflection remains. In every era, on every trading floor, in every moment when belief outpaces reality. The railway king is dead. The railway mania is not. The Iron Road is rebuilt in every generation, repaved, rebranded, promising something new, carrying passengers who are hopeful, confident, certain, and largely unaware of where it leads. The question is not whether another mania will come. It will. The question is whether the institutions we have built, the regulators, the central banks, the press, the auditors, the legislators, are strong enough and independent enough to sound the alarm in time, and whether,
When that alarm is sounded, a society intoxicated by the promise of effortless wealth will have the discipline to listen. The Victorian answer was no, and the record of the centuries since offers very little reason to believe it has changed. Sleep now.